we were interested in kind of the spatial product of maybe these different narratives, which is sort of possibly trying to achieve similar goals at the end of the day. And often, definitely in London, there's a lot of ongoing interest in Danish post-war housing, the kind of mass perimeter block and the sort of egalitarian unit of housing that it provides, and this kind of model, which I think in a lot of situations would still be described as livable in some ways, like it has a lot of crossovers with the narrative of livability, even if there's been a huge amount of repair and improvement of these kind of spaces. And that differs a lot to the kind of contemporary version of Danish housing, which I think is trying to do something quite different, although probably proclaims to have kind of similar ambitions, I guess. Do you see, and maybe this is kind of leading into the idea of, or the distinction between welfare and livability, and how the creation of certain housing typologies is directly linked to the kind of policies and systems which allow that housing to be produced in the first place?
Yes, I mean, there are a lot of different kind of discussions that could go into that. I think one of them is that maybe the commonality is an interest which, let's say, has been a strong focus, and to some extent has been relatively successful, is the typology that engages the courtyard, what we could call the kind of Copenhagen courtyard, as something between the kind of semi-public and semi-private. And that is a space which for many who've kind of discussed this typology, provides a certain kind of quality that in a way becomes a strong and important space for some level of kind of community, or what is called fellowship in a Danish context, where this kind of space, which is shared common space within the development but not publicly accessible, has been something which has been strongly focused on and developed in recent periods. So I think that both that version and, let's say, the more contemporary examples that you show, I think have a common interest, and the more contemporary examples are trying to explore and in some ways test or try to kind of continue to develop around what this kind of space in between the interior space of the apartment and the public space, per se, that these become spaces of investigation. And I think that would be something that one could argue is something of interest and focus in the Danish context, not just then, but also now, and also in between to a certain extent. And one could say that some of the things that have changed, or some of the factors that are quite different, have to do with things like the kind of structuring of commissioning of such projects, who is developing them, and what the kind of agendas are behind those aspects of the projects. So one sees in this sort of larger discussion, where all these sort of things link up, is of course one aspect of the success of Copenhagen's sort of recent development in the last decades after the 1990s has been the sort of success story, which has translated into this sort of rapid increase of housing prices in the city. That period's also corresponded to the massive increase in land prices in the city, which has made the kind of sort of the mechanisms to allow for what is being called the almene sector, which could be translated in different ways, but it's been translated largely into social housing, although it's not social housing in the typical sense, because it's addressing all different groups of population. But this notion of social housing has been very difficult to develop. And that has also kind of aligned to a shift where the actors in producing buildings, particularly housing in the last decades, has shifted drastically from those kind of actors, such as housing associations, to the private developer. And we've seen a massive change just in a kind of 30 or 40 year period, where now almost all of the new housing developments in Copenhagen are being led by developers. And I think that has kind of impacts on other kind of tendencies toward how the housing market works. I think it also has other tendencies that are linked to kind of broader societal shifts, such as the idea of the development of individualization and the notion of how that also impacts on the way that housing developments are kind of designed and marketed. And we see that play out, for example, from the notion also of a kind of welfare, a universal welfare housing for the masses, to the idea of highly differentiated housing sort of imagery, but to a large extent very much developed through the formulas of the market, which produce at the same time, in a way almost paradoxically, a great deal of homogeneity in what is being produced in housing now.
And how do you think that relates to the kind of, say, the domestic commons, the space around that, in that I guess the agenda that was producing something like this also allowed for this colossal courtyard, which was a semi-private, semi-public communal space. How do you think that plays out in contemporary developments like this in Copenhagen, where the developer doesn't have the same interest in providing that kind of space?
Yes,
and don't necessarily have the possibility to, because they own a plot which they have to develop. All of the market parameters are kind of encouraging them to push their building to the limits of the plot, and that kind of desire to invest in that domestic common space is probably far more restrained.
Yes, exactly. And I guess you see subtle changes in the nature of what is between private and public. In some cases, more drastic changes. So we see obviously the development of the kind of balcony as a kind of essential element in many of these contemporary housing areas. We see also, as you suggested, a kind of squeezing down based on the profitability of the scale of those spaces, and of course things like their quality in terms of light access and so forth. And one sees also the in some cases, for example, the figure 8, where a building like that also is to some extent conceived of as an important sort of icon of that area of development. And it was sort of an important part that courtyard would be publicly accessible. And one sees all of the sort of the trickiness also of this sort of negotiation space between the sort of semi-public and semi-private, and between the private and public on those extremes. And obviously this has become an important building in sort of a larger discussion about architecture, and it's attracted a lot of people visiting it. And there's been, maybe you've sort of followed that discussion, but there have been sort of resistance from the residents there, who are actually getting tired of the sort of foot traffic in a space which for them is more semi-private than semi-public. For example, on these sort of long pathways up into the higher levels that you see here in the kind of hatched or textured tone. And then, of course, there's a sort of buffer space of what would be a kind of row house, or translation of a row house front yard, if you think of a sort of potato row type typology. But the space of that is squeezed down. The kind of climatic conditions are a little bit more problematic, where it's quite exposed and windy. As I mentioned, there is a lot of foot traffic from different people. There is a sort of different condition in that courtyard, and that it's publicly accessible and quite a lot used in one way, but not in another way. And so we see, some similar intentions, but different aspects of it. But it's not to argue, I would argue that it's not a failure, this building. There are, I think, many interesting aspects to it that are worth considering and discussing. But the terms through which it's produced, I think, are quite different